Fichter Friday, welcome back. This week I will be wrapping up my 5-part series on altitude training. A reminder, make sure you subscribe to Want to Get Fast on Patreon to learn a little bit more about altitude training, and you can find videos and presentations for sale on CoachTube and previous Track Football Consortium replays. Now, I've shared previously how I call altitude drops depth drops in my training. Basically because I use the term or use the exercise depth jumps. So depth drops kind of just fit in seamlessly. And what I found, like a lot of exercises, depth drops are something that the best athletes do the best. Personally, I think I use depth drops a lot within my training. And if they're not plugged into kind of the main focus or main circuit of the day for a workout, they're at least somewhere in the warm-up. And the big reason for that is they work. Right? Depth drops work from my understanding of the nervous system, from my understanding of co-contractions and stiffness and overcoming fear. Depth drops work. Before moving on any further, I want to review the static spring from DB Hammer because I feel like altitude training fits so well into this concept. In the static spring, DB Hammer talks about our muscles having this ability to lock down our joints during a collision, as altitude training calls it. What this means for me is when we're sprinting or when we are jumping, that brief moment where our foot is coming in contact with the ground, or that bottom of that counter movement, that amortization phase, that's the static, right? As that foot is making contact with the ground, all the muscles around our foot, ankle, knee, hip, torso, everything needs to lock down for that brief moment of co-contraction. Again, this kind of combines all the things from DB Hammer and Franz Bosch. If you do not have a strong static, right, if you don't have that strong co-contraction or that strong stiffness when your foot is hitting the ground or you're in the bottom of your counter movement in a jump, it's going to be like pushing off of sand versus concrete, and you're going to lose a lot of power. Right? The classic example of taking a ball, slamming it on the ground, having that strong static or that ability to lock down ankle, knee, hip as your foot is making contact or collision with the ground is going to propel you like slamming a ball off of concrete, versus if ankle, knee, hip joint, torso, angles, and all that are off and you hit that ground and you have deformation in those joints, it'll be like pushing off of sand. And for me, I've yet to find a training method or modality that kind of highlights the static of the static spring like depth drops or like altitude training does. When I look at one of my athletes standing on a box, dropping off, landing, performing depth drops, all I kind of see there is resisting deformation training, training the body, training the muscles, training the central nervous system to co-contract, to create stiffness, to resist deformation, all within that split second of this kind of high load, high velocity movement that a depth drop is. Personally, when I'm watching somebody perform a depth drop, first I'm kind of just looking at the whole picture. When they land, do they just look like mush, or can they land and stick it and look just like a statue? So kind of just assessing what it looks like. A lot of faults, you'll see the chest start to come forward, but really what I'm looking at is I want to see minimal deformation in the knees. When they land, can they handle all that velocity of 9.8 meters per second squared of gravity pulling them down? Can they handle all that load of their body weight getting pulled down by gravity? Every coach is going to be different. Every coach is going to have their different coaching cues, and I don't know if I'm alone in this when I coach depth drops, but how I cue my athletes is when they land, I want their heels slightly off the ground. This might not be the best way or the way that everybody else teaches it, but what it does for me is it creates an awareness of, oh wow, my feet are really weak. Coach, I'm trying to land with my heels slightly off the ground, but they keep hitting the ground. Well, we need to be a little bit stronger. We need to be able to handle and resist that force and resist that deformation in our feet. Otherwise, when we go to skate, when we go to sprint, when we are going down in our counter movement jumps, we're going to have that deformation as well. So step off, land with heels slightly off the ground, how I coach depth drops. Then, once my athletes can handle stepping off a decently high box and landing with minimal knee deformation, minimal kind of chest coming forward, their heels could stay slightly off the ground, then we have to get weird. And this is a concept that I've learned from Chris Corfist. Once you can kind of handle the basic variation, you're not giving your body an extra stimulus to adapt to, especially in the weird training of training the nervous system through altitude training, depth drops, collisions, and things like that. So some of the variations that I use will be head turns. Step off a box, turn your head, or turn your body. Step off a box, turn your body and land, or step off your box, land with split feet. Just different variations to give the body something new and novel to adapt to. When we are playing sport, it's not this perfect, absolutely linear, straightforward and back type of training like we often do in the weight room. So a head turn kind of simulates, all right, I'm going to at some point be sprinting, skating, jumping, landing, and my head might be turned to the side. And that will be a completely new movement, a completely new exercise for that athlete and for their body to kind of overcome that new stimulus that more likely than not they're going to see in sport, which is very randomized. If you're like me, I really struggled at the beginning when I first started learning about altitude training of where and when to kind of plug it in. But what I found is it worked really well into my kind of bastardized version of French contrast training. So in the classic French contrast method, which was popularized in triphasic training by Cal Dietz and Ben Peterson, athletes will kind of go through this sort of circuit or setup, compound lift, followed by some sort of plyometric, followed by some sort of weighted jump, and then some sort of overspeed plyometric. And in my kind of bastardized French contrast version, I take this template, and the first exercise we're going to do is a measured jump. So it could be a vertical, it could be a broad jump. And especially in the off season, we're going to auto regulate all of these exercises based off of our performance set by set on our measured jump. Then we would go into a compound plyo, weighted, and then typically I'm doing a sprint here or some sort of overspeed jump, the classic green band jumps. And eventually from taking the French contrast into kind of my version and how it fits for me, I realized during this kind of weighted portion, right before my sprint or overspeed after my plyos, that was a great place to plug in depth drops. So the athlete will do a jump on a jump mat, let's say, they'll do a split squat, some hurdles, then they'll go over to the depth drops and practice stepping off, landing in any sort of different form or variation. And I like that it kind of takes away the fear. I like that it works on co-contraction. I like that it works on stiffness before they walk out of the weight room into the hallway and then go for their sprint. So that is how I primarily plug depth drops into my training. To kind of close things out on the altitude training series, I wanted to share some of my thoughts, just kind of random things I write on my whiteboard, just different ideas. So a lot of this is inspired by Dan, Chris Corfist, and then a lot of Cal Dietz as well. So during the Revolutions in Speed training clinic, Cal had people standing on a box and they were getting pulled over speed by the 1080 Quantum. And the more I thought about that, it was kind of an overspeed effect where if you're pulling somebody at, let's just say 10 or 11 meters per second off that box and asking them to land, now you're applying an overspeed stimulus because they are falling or getting pulled faster than the rate of gravity. So got to kind of thinking about that idea. I don't have a 1080 Quantum, but I do have racks and bands. So over here, the kind of idea is we're going to stand in our rack and we'll have the bands behind us. We'll kind of cinch our way back into it and then it'll push us off the box a little bit over speed. So we'll try that out and see how that one goes. This is something I just stole this from Dan and Chris Corfist from their videos, or the How to Get Fast series, where they had their long jumper wearing the bands over her shoulders and they had their feet in the bands. Here, I'm just going to attach it to kind of the bottom band pegs of my racks. So stand on the box, we have the bands. So it'll be not only altitude training, but over speed, and then with all the Chris Corfist kind of foot things, I might be able to adapt this one to have some sort of slice or flick to it, and the band is going to shoot you forward. And then kind of taking those concepts of, Dan has a video on Twitter. He showed it in different presentations where he has athletes doing kind of like a boom boom off of a 45-pound plate. So even that there, even adding that 3-4 inches off of a bumper plate of landing on the ground is going to be an overspeed stimulus. It's going to be a collision or altitude training that you're not going to get from normal sprinting or normal boom boom. So standing on a 45-pound plate and then taking Chris Korfist's kind of concepts, can I do a prime time off of that? So just a single leg prime time or slice. And then off of that 45-pound plate, can I apply that overspeed or that collision training stimulus with now a prime time or a slice into a flick coming off of it? So can your body handle that extra 2 to 3 inches after you've already mastered that exercise? And then this guy down here, I'm a big fan of holding something in front of you, dropping and catching. And Dan has different videos like that on Patreon. But once we've kind of handled that, I guess we could drop it from higher. I guess we could use a higher weight, whether it's a med ball or a plate that we're catching. But I kind of have this crazy idea of hooking bands on my bottom band pegs. So let's just say a medicine ball, letting that get pulled down over speed, and now I have to catch and stop that med ball from falling, kind of just adding a bit more stress and stimulus to it. And most of these ideas that kind of pop into my head, I'm either seeing on a social media account from Dan, or these are just kind of ideas and concepts that I've stolen over the years from Chris Korfist or Cal Dietz as well. A reminder, please share some of the things that Dan and Want to Get Fast have taught you. Make sure you subscribe to Want to Get Fast on Patreon. Thanks for watching Fichter Friday.